You feel it, don't you? That the more empty someone seems, the faster they rise. That loud, shallow people dominate the spotlight, while the quiet ones, the thinkers, the deep souls, remain ignored, invisible, erased. There's a silent fear growing inside people like you, that your truth might be too complex, too heavy, too real for the world to want. And you're not wrong. You were told that depth was a virtue, that being authentic, emotional, self-aware would make you stand out. But the more you try to live like that, the more you saw yourself being pushed to the margins. Your depth became a weight in a world built for surfaces. And no one explained why. That's what we're going to uncover now. Not with cheap answers, but with something far more uncomfortable: clarity. Because what if I told you the system was never broken? It was built this way. What if success, as defined by modern culture, was never about essence, but about efficiency? Here's the truth that most people don't have the stomach to admit. The modern world rewards superficiality, not by accident, but by design. And the reason is brutally simple. Shallow people are easier to predict, easier to mold, easier to sell. Machiavelli warned us centuries ago, power doesn't need virtue. It just needs the appearance of it. It is not necessary to be good, only to appear good. That was his warning. And today, that sentence isn't just a political strategy. It's the emotional blueprint of social media, branding, careers, and even relationships. Impression has overtaken intention. The image became more important than the reality. And so we adapted. We crafted personas. We learned to speak in polished fragments. We made ourselves smaller, more pleasing, more presentable. Not because we wanted to, but because we realized that complexity makes people uncomfortable. And discomfort doesn't sell. But here's the danger Jung tried to show us. The more you live through a mask, the more you forget it's a mask. Jung called it the persona, the socially accepted identity we build to survive. But survival comes with a cost, and that cost is truth. Because when your persona becomes your only identity, the self begins to die. And culture, modern, fast, distracted culture, encourages that death. It doesn't want reflection. It wants reaction. It doesn't want questions. It wants performance. And it definitely doesn't want you to stop and ask what all this performance is actually for. A 2019 study from the University of Pennsylvania, Twenge et al., confirmed what many already suspected. We are experiencing a cultural explosion of narcissistic behavior patterns. Not because people suddenly became evil, but because the system now rewards image over essence, validation over connection. And that's where the real tragedy begins. Because the deeper you are, the harder it is to be seen. The more honest you are, the more you threaten the illusion. So the system adapts by making you feel like the problem. But you're not the problem. You're the proof that something in this world is deeply sick. And that sickness has a name. It's the glorification of the hollow. It's a reason why modern culture transforms superficiality into success. And if that sentence hits something raw in you, then stay. Because the further we go, the darker and more honest it gets. They don't tell you this up front, but depth is a risk. Not because it's dangerous in itself, but because it reveals what others spend their entire lives trying to avoid. Your silence holds more truth than their words. Your pauses expose what their noise is built to hide. And that's why being complex in a world that worships simplicity doesn't make you powerful. It makes you inconvenient. The culture doesn't hate depth because it's dark. It fears it because it's slow, because it demands effort. And effort doesn't convert well. Attention spans have collapsed. Algorithms reward instant clarity, not layered nuance. A study from UCLA showed that videos under 15 seconds generate over 80% more engagement than anything that requires real attention. That's not just a tech insight. It's a psychological diagnosis of an entire generation. The world no longer has patience for what takes time to understand. But depth isn't just about slowness. It's about contradiction. It's about living with unresolved parts, fragmented beliefs, old wounds that don't fit cleanly into categories. And that terrifies a system designed for labels, for certainty, for controllable personas. You, with your intensity, your questions, your refusal to be packaged. You break the algorithm. You confuse the pattern. You take up space the system can't process. So it retaliates, not with violence, but with invisibility. People stop calling. Platforms stop showing your work. Your words get ignored, not because they lack value, but because they demand presence. And presence is too rare to be profitable. The more depth you offer, the fewer people stay. Not because you're too much, but because they were never trained to hold anything real. That's why superficiality became the new success. It's not a flaw. It's a strategy. The system has conditioned the masses to crave stimulation, not substance. And stimulation doesn't require connection. It just needs repetition. If you're predictable, you're profitable. If you're deep, you're dangerous because you remind people of everything they've buried to survive. This is the cost of being real, of being thoughtful in a culture that rewards speed over meaning, gloss over truth. But here's what no one tells you. The discomfort you feel isn't a sign of failure. It's evidence that you've outgrown the script. And maybe that's why you're here, because some part of you still refuses to be simplified. If that's true, and this spoke to you in any way, do something that doesn't cost you anything, but helps us keep this channel alive. Subscribe. One click. That's it. You don't have to explain. You don't have to agree with everything. But if this kind of depth matters to you, if this silence between the words means something, your subscription tells the system, this voice deserves to keep speaking. Thank you. What happens when truth becomes optional, but performance becomes mandatory? You start to see exactly what we're living now. A society where being real is irrelevant and being convincing is everything. That shift isn't accidental. It's a deliberate evolution of power, one that Machiavelli predicted long before smartphones, hashtags, or brand partnerships. He wrote it plainly. It is not necessary to be good, only to appear so. That wasn't a cynicism. It was a mirror. And today, that mirror reflects the faces of influencers, politicians, CEOs, even therapists and spiritual leaders, all trapped in the same machinery of curated perception. This isn't just about lying. It's about replacing sincerity with strategy, about treating emotion as marketing, identity as branding, relationships as leverage. Because the modern world doesn't ask who you are. It asks, what do you look like while being it? That shift might sound abstract, but its consequences are tangible. The Harvard Business Review published research revealing that charisma and the appearance of competence are often valued more highly in leadership than actual competence itself. In other words, we no longer promote based on substance. We promote based on performance. And that performance isn't limited to job interviews or campaigns. It invades every corner of life. You perform resilience when you're crumbling. You perform happiness while dissociating. You perform confidence just to survive. And the better you get at performing, the more you're rewarded, until the mask becomes the only version of you the world recognizes. But there's a cost, because while your image climbs, your essence fades. What Machiavelli understood, and what culture has twisted into a doctrine, is that perception is the true currency of power. And so, we invest in it. We polish it, filter it, monetize it. We sell versions of ourselves that generate admiration, envy, or desire. But what we don't realize is that every version we sell is a little further from what we actually are. Eventually, the truth starts to rot in the basement of the persona. And this rot is what we call burnout. Identity confusion, quiet despair. It's what happens when the self begins to suffocate under the weight of constant impression management. We live in a culture that says, be visible or vanish. But what it really means is, be pleasing or be punished. And the pleasing version of you, it can't be too strange, too sad, too smart, too silent. It has to be legible, attractive, safe, marketable. And so you trade reality for readability. You become easier to understand, easier to like. And with every concession, a little more of your depth gets cut away. Until one day you realize, people love you, but they don't know you. And worse, you don't even remember what it felt like to be known. That's the empire of impression. That's the silent monarchy that rules the modern world. Not through violence, but through applause. Not through laws, but through metrics. Not through chains, but through validation. And maybe the reason you're still watching is because applause stopped feeling like enough. Because performance, no matter how perfect, never made you feel seen, only consumed. And that hunger to be witnessed without editing still lingers. The question is, are you still willing to pay the price of being real in a world that only rewards illusions? It begins innocently enough. A small adjustment here, a polished sentence there. You learn which parts of you get celebrated and which ones get ignored. So you hide the inconvenient truths, the sadness that lingers too long, the silence that others find unsettling, the thoughts that don't fit into polite conversation. You start curating yourself, not out of malice, not out of vanity, but out of necessity. And that's the trap. You build a version of yourself to survive, and then the world falls in love with the version, not the person. What began as a survival mechanism slowly becomes a prison. Jung warned us with clarity. The persona is a necessary mask, but when you identify with it too deeply, you lose access to the self. And losing access doesn't mean forgetting who you are. It means forgetting that anything else ever existed. You stop questioning whether you're being honest, because everyone around you rewards the version you've created. You're praised for your strength when you're actually numb. You're admired for your charisma when you're chronically dissociated. And soon, even your own mind starts believing the image. That's the moment when your image becomes your identity. The American Psychological Association published a study showing a 47% increase in identity-related distress in adults exposed to high levels of digital comparison and performance culture. That's not just a number. That's a generation living through emotional fragmentation, caught between the person they perform and the person they abandoned. And here's the cruel twist. The more successful your persona becomes, the more you're trapped by it. Because now you have something to maintain, an audience to satisfy, a brand to protect. You become loyal to your own mask, because removing it feels like betrayal, not freedom. You might even start defending that mask, pushing away anything or anyone who threatens to see beneath it. Vulnerability becomes dangerous. Intimacy becomes terrifying, because if someone gets close enough to see the cracks, the whole illusion might collapse. But deep down, in the quiet spaces of your day, when the notifications stop and the mirrors go dark, you feel it. That ache, that distance, like watching your life from the outside, like being applauded in a language you no longer understand. That's not fame. That's emotional exile. And it doesn't matter if you're liked, followed, or praised. If those things are aimed at a version of you that isn't real, then all they do is reinforce the loneliness. Because now you're not just unseen by others. You're invisible to yourself. This is the cost of confusing persona with person, of selling the mask so many times that you forgot where your own voice ends and the performance begins. And the worst part? You did everything right. You followed the rules. You built a version of yourself that was digestible, admirable, successful. And it worked, until it didn't. Because performance can't hold pain. And eventually, all the grief you've hidden, all the truths you compress to fit the image, they begin to leak. Not dramatically, quietly, subtly, in the form of exhaustion, numbness, émotionnelle absence. And that's when the prison starts to feel real. Not because the world locked you in, but because you forgot where the door was. It's not a glitch. It's a design. The feeling that your attention is always scattered, that you're constantly consuming, yet never fulfilled, that everything is loud, fast, urgent, but somehow meaningless. That isn't a personal flaw. It's the product of a system built to fracture your mind. Because fragmentation in the digital age is more profitable than wholeness. You've probably noticed, the more time you spend online, the less time you spend with yourself. Every scroll, every click, every red notification, they pull you further away from coherence, from clarity, from presence. What you feel is disconnection. What the system sees is engagement. Platforms weren't designed to help you connect. They were designed to keep you reactive, predictable, monetizable. The more fragmented your emotional state, the more likely you are to stay on the feed. Rage keeps you scrolling. Envy fuels the algorithm. Emptiness makes you click. And your pain, especially when it's unprocessed, becomes behavioral data. A study from Duke University in 2020 confirmed this with terrifying clarity. Social media platforms reward impulsive emotional content not because it's better, but because it keeps people locked in longer. And longer attention means more data. More data means more power. Not for you, but for the machine that learns how to sell you back to yourself. That's how the algorithm of emptiness works. It doesn't want you whole. It wants you in pieces. Because people in pieces are easier to manipulate, easier to influence, easier to sell to. You become the product, and the system teaches you to enjoy it. It even flatters you, gives you numbers, notifications, signals of importance. But what it never gives you is rest, or depth, or integration, because stillness would make you question everything. Stillness would make you remember that you're more than what you post. And that's bad for business. This is why you feel drained after hours online, even if you didn't do anything. Your nervous system wasn't designed for constant stimulation without meaning. Your mind wasn't built to process 1,000 half-formed impressions without space to think. But in the culture of fragmentation, speed is survival. If you slow down, you disappear. So you stay, half present, half aware, half alive. And that's exactly where the system wants you. Because when you're fragmented, you stop asking the real questions. You stop wondering who you were before the feed, what silence used to feel like, what attention meant before it was traded for dopamine hits. And the deeper tragedy? You begin to mistake that constant flicker of activity for aliveness. But stimulation isn't connection, and reaction isn't awareness. In the algorithm's world, your identity is just another metric. Your confusion is a feature, not a flaw. And every time you reach for your phone out of boredom, loneliness, or habit, the system wins again. Because it doesn't just want your time, it wants yourself. But maybe what you're starting to realize is that this isn't just exhausting. It's spiritual theft, a slow erasure of what once made you feel real. And the question that begins to haunt you is this. If the world profits from your distraction, what could it lose if you remembered how to pay attention again? Eventually, the system doesn't even need to distract you anymore. It just needs to convince you that numbness is peace. After years of overexposure, overstimulation, and emotional fragmentation, something inside begins to shut down. Not dramatically, subtly. You stop feeling outraged. You stop feeling hopeful. You stop expecting conversations to go deep, people to be honest, or life to be anything other than tolerable. And that resignation, that quiet disconnection, is mistaken for maturity, for stability, for strength. But it's not strength. It's anesthesia. Because when you've been emotionally burned enough times, you stop reaching for the flame. And when everything in your culture rewards performance over presence, detachment becomes a survival instinct. So you start applauding your own ability to handle anything, not realizing that what you're really celebrating is the slow erosion of your capacity to feel. Success today demands this emotional silence. Not introspection, not sensitivity, just the ability to keep going without asking why. Just the willingness to stay productive, composed, digestible. You become the master of repression. Your pain is dressed in professionalism. Your fatigue in discipline. Your confusion in politeness. And the world loves you for it, because your dormancy makes you useful. But here's the damage that no one talks about. You start to believe that this is what growth looks like. That being unbothered means being evolved. That having no reaction means you've healed. But healing isn't about suppressing. It's about integrating. And what most people call peace is just well-managed suppression. The Stanford Mind and Body Lab released a study showing that environments demanding constant high performance are directly linked to clinical levels of emotional dissociation in nearly 30% of adults. This isn't burnout. It's psychological withdrawal, a defense mechanism triggered by a system that doesn't allow rest, only quiet obedience. So when you feel yourself going blank, don't mistake that for calm. Real calm is alive, present, awake. What you're experiencing is a shutdown. a form of self-abandonment that the world applauds because it keeps things running smoothly. You're not reacting, so they call you balanced. But you're not balanced. You're just tired of reacting to a world that refuses to change. And perhaps the most dangerous part of all is that they've renamed your numbness. They've called it peace, stoicism, resilience. But numbness isn't resilience. It's what happens when your emotional system gives up on being understood. You weren't born this way. You learned this, piece by piece, smile by smile. Every time you buried your disappointment just to keep the peace. Every time you edited your truth to avoid conflict. Every time you chose silence over honesty. Not because it was wise, but because it was safer. And now you wonder why nothing feels real anymore. Because you've trained yourself to feel nothing. And the world has rewarded you for it. But maybe, just maybe, you're starting to sense that peace shouldn't feel this dead. That calm shouldn't feel this cold. That presence, real presence, should feel like something. And if that suspicion has been growing in you, then trust it. Because numbness isn't a destination. It's a symptom. And pretending it's peace won't keep you safe. It will only keep you asleep. There comes a point where silence stops being protective and starts becoming a cage. After enough years of pretending, performing, adapting, something in you begins to rot. Not visibly, but silently. The joy you used to feel in small moments, dull. The desire to create, to speak, to reach, muted. The connection to your own life, disconnected. It's not depression in the clinical sense. It's dismemberment, the quiet psychological consequence of becoming everything the world applauds, but nothing that feels like you. And yet, people still call you well-adjusted. Because on the outside, everything looks functional. You show up, you deliver, you smile on cue, you say the right things, avoid the hard ones, and never make anyone too uncomfortable. You've mastered the art of being agreeable, but you've forgotten the feeling of being alive. And that's where the illusion begins to fracture. Somewhere in that numb rhythm, a whisper starts to grow. A suspicion, a hunger, the faint memory of a version of you that wasn't shaped by applause, fear, or convenience. A version that once felt things fully, even when it hurt. That told the truth, even when it cost. That refused to be flattened into a persona. And that memory becomes unbearable to ignore. Because once you've tasted the weight of your own silence, you begin to crave the weight of your own voice. That's when you realize something that feels more like a confession than a discovery. Being whole in this world is an act of rebellion. Not dramatic rebellion, not rage or spectacle, but the kind that happens quietly in the way you start telling the truth again, in the way you stop apologizing for being too much, in the way you let go of roles that once felt safe and start becoming someone dangerous to the system, someone who doesn't need to be liked to be real. Because this world doesn't reward wholeness. It rewards consistency, predictability, palatability. It rewards people who stay in character, even when their soul is screaming. And that's why choosing to be whole, to be all your contradictions, all your shadow, all your unfinished truth, is revolutionary. Not because it makes you special, but because it makes you sovereign. You start setting limits, not as defense, but as declaration. You stop explaining your silence. You stop shrinking your grief. You stop dressing your anger in politeness just to be accepted. And slowly, people start pulling away. They say you've changed, that you're colder, that you're difficult now. But you're not difficult. You're just done being digestible. And the ones who stay, they meet the real you. Not the curated echo, not the pleasing reflection, but the raw, awkward, vibrant soul you buried beneath survival. That's the turning point when you realize you're no longer performing. You're living, fully, loudly, even when you're quiet. And it won't feel like victory at first. It might feel like loneliness, like disorientation, like death. Because the death of the mask is a real grief. But underneath it is the birth of your actual life. A life where you don't have to ask permission to exist. A life where success is redefined, not as recognition, but as alignment. Because maybe the world will never clap for this version of you. Maybe the applause will fade. The numbers will drop. The audience will thin. but at least you'll belong to yourself. And in a culture that sells identity for clicks and authenticity for influence, that might be the most radical thing you can do. You don't need to be perfect. You just need to stop editing your soul to fit someone else's frame. Let them call it rebellion. You'll know it's just the truth, finally unmuted. Somewhere along the way, you stopped recognizing your own reflection. Not because your face changed, but because the person you once were has been buried under layers of survival. You became who you needed to be accepted, admired, tolerated. You adapted, you performed, and maybe it worked. For a while. But adaptation has a cost, and the bill always comes due. Jung called it the return of the repressed. Everything you disown to fit in, the rage, the fear, the grief, the tenderness, it doesn't disappear. It waits, in silence, in dreams, in subtle sabotages, in the quiet emptiness that follows even your proudest moments. Because success means nothing if it's built on a version of you that was never whole. Individuation, for Jung, wasn't about becoming better. It was about becoming real. Integrating the persona without becoming it. Facing the shadow without collapsing into it. Reclaiming the fragments of self you were told were too much, too strange, too inconvenient. Because what you reject in yourself doesn't die. It gains power. And what you pretend to be eventually becomes a prison. Kierkegaard called this the despair of inauthenticity, the pain of living as someone you never chose to be. He didn't define despair as screaming into the void. He defined it as never daring to be yourself. And that is the crisis most people never name. They suffer not from failure, but from role fatigue. From waking up each day and wearing a costume so believable that even they forget it was stitched from fear. But the moment of clarity always arrives. Quietly. You don't even recognize it at first. Maybe it's a question you can't ignore anymore. Maybe it's a truth that slips out mid-sentence and makes you pause. Maybe it's just the ache of existing in a life that no longer fits. And suddenly, silence starts to feel louder than applause. You start noticing how numb you've become, how edited, how distant from the intensity you once had. Not just the pain, but the joy too. Because numbness doesn't just protect you from what hurts. It also blocks what matters. That's when the return begins. It's not glamorous. It doesn't come with fireworks. Sometimes it feels like falling apart. But in that collapse, something sacred reawakens. Your refusal to be manageable. Your refusal to shrink. Your refusal to keep trading authenticity for safety. And that refusal is your rebellion. Because in a world that sells you curated selves and polished narratives, showing up as whole, flawed, feeling unfiltered is revolutionary. You may lose people, you may lose platforms, but what you gain is presence, alignment, a life that no longer feels like a staged version of itself. And maybe that's why you're here. Not because you need one more answer, but because you needed one less lie. This space was built for that. For the misfits of the algorithm. For the ones who feel too much, question too deeply, and break too easily when forced into small boxes. And if that's you, stay. Help us keep this alive. Subscribe. It's free, and it helps us keep going. Now go. Watch another video. Let the next mirror find you. Let the next rupture break what still holds you back. You're not here to perform. You're here to return.